The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen table since Tuesday. Eleanor Dawson had moved around it for 3 days. She had set her coffee cup beside it. She had laid the morning newspaper over it. She had even turned it face down once, as if the words printed on the front might crawl off the page if she left them staring upward long enough. But on Friday morning, with the October light coming gray and flat through the window above the sink, she finally picked it up again, unfolded the letter inside, and read it for what she knew was the last time she would allow herself to read it. 30 days. That was what it came down to. 30 days before First Harvest Bank of Grover County would begin formal foreclosure proceedings on the property at 4114 Mill Creek Road. The letter used careful language, the kind of language that lawyers write and bankers sign, language designed to sound reasonable while it takes everything you have. Words like "unfortunately" and "despite our efforts and in the interest of all parties," as if the bank had a heart somewhere inside its marble lobby and its mahogany desks, as if any of this was unfortunate to them. Eleanor set the letter down and looked out the window. The farm stretched away from the house in every direction, 80 acres of Iowa flatland that she and Robert had worked together for 42 years. The fields were bare now, turned over for winter, the dark soil lying in long furrows that caught the pale light and held it. The old barn stood to the north, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The equipment shed, the grain bins, the fence lines running out to the property edges, the posts leaning at different angles like old men who had been standing too long. And at the far edge of it all, almost at the tree line, the small structure that Robert had always called his workshop. Corrugated metal walls gone orange and brown with rust. A sagging roof line. A padlocked door she had never once opened in 42 years of living on this land. Eleanor was 68 years old. She had been a widow for 1 year and 3 days. And she was about to lose the only home she had ever shared with the man she had loved since she was 25 years old. The debt was $180,000. It had not happened all at once. It had happened the way most catastrophes happen, slowly then suddenly. 3 bad harvests in a row years, where the rain came wrong or didn't come at all. Cattle prices dropping below the cost of feed. Equipment breaking down at the worst possible moments. The repairs eating into money they didn't have. They had borrowed against the property. They had taken loans. They had deferred and restructured and made arrangements that always seemed manageable until they weren't. And then there was Robert's heart. He had been sick for longer than he told her. She understood that now. The decade of medications, the hospital stays he called routine, the doctor's appointments he attended alone and summarized afterward in ways that were technically accurate but strategically incomplete. By the time the medical bills were real, they were enormous. Robert had managed the finances all their married life. He had a head for numbers, a quiet patience with columns of figures that Eleanor had always admired and never tried to replicate. She trusted him. You trust the person you have shared a bed with for 4 decades. She had not known how bad it was until after he was gone. He died on a December night 14 months ago in the bed they had shared since 1983. A massive coronary, the doctor said. Quick. No warning. Eleanor had reached for him in the morning, the way she always did, a small, unconscious gesture, and his hand was cold. She had tried to hold the farm together after that. She had worked 16-hour days through the winter and into the spring. She had sold cattle she couldn't afford to sell and hired help she couldn't afford to hire. She had made phone calls and filled out forms and sat across from men in offices who spoke to her in careful, sympathetic tones, while their eyes said something else entirely. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. The knock at the front door came at 10 o'clock that morning, 40 minutes after she had set the bank's letter back on the table. Victor Crane was 45 years old and dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Eleanor's monthly Social Security check. He had the kind of face that was probably handsome when he smiled, which he was doing now, standing on her porch with his leather portfolio under one arm and his clean shoes already picking up traces of the mud that never fully dried in October. He was the vice president of First Harvest Bank. He had called ahead. She had expected him. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for making time." She shook it. "Come in." He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table Robert had built by hand in 1987, oak planks fitted together with wooden pegs because Robert had believed that a table ought to be something that lasted. Victor Crane set his portfolio on it and folded his hands and looked at her with an expression that he had clearly practiced many times. I want you to know, he said, that this is not a situation the bank takes any pleasure in. I imagine not, Eleanor said. You've been a customer of First Harvest for over 30 years. Robert was a man the whole community respected. This isn't something any of us wanted to see happen. But it's happening anyway. He paused, adjusted his expression slightly. The numbers are what they are, Mrs. Dawson. The debt exceeds the current assessed value of the property. The farm isn't generating income. Holding on past the point of viability isn't something we can continue to support no matter how much we'd like to. 42 years, Eleanor said. I'm sorry. I've lived on this land for 42 years. My husband broke this ground with his own hands. We buried 2 dogs in the northeast corner of the back field. We planted a tree the year we thought we were finally going to have a child, and it didn't happen, so that tree is the closest thing to a child we ever had. She paused. I just want to make sure you understand what 30 days means to me before we talk about what it means to the bank. Victor Crane looked at her for a moment. Then he opened his portfolio and began explaining the terms of the foreclosure process. She let him talk. She listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she thanked him for coming, and she stood up, and he understood that the meeting was over. She walked him to the door. He stepped off the porch and crossed the yard toward his car, a silver Mercedes that looked as out of place on a dirt farm road as a yacht in a cornfield. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched him go. He got in the car. The engine started. He pulled forward a few yards, and then he stopped. Not at the end of the driveway where he would have turned onto the road. He stopped halfway just past the fence line in a spot where the lane bent slightly and gave a clear view of the property's far edge. Eleanor watched him sit there for a long moment. Then she saw him lift his phone to his ear. He was looking at the shed, not at the house, not at the barn, or the fields, or the grain bins. He was looking directly at Robert's workshop, the small, rusted structure at the edge of the tree line, and he was on the phone and his eyes did not move from it for the full 30 seconds before he finally pulled onto the road and drove away. Eleanor stood in the doorway for another minute after his car disappeared. A cold wind moved across the yard carrying the smell of turned earth and coming rain. She thought, he knows something is in there. And then for the first time she thought, what is in there? She had never asked Robert directly. Not once in 42 years. He had told her early in their marriage that the workshop was his space, his private corner of the farm, the place where he kept his tools and worked on projects she didn't need to worry about. She had accepted that the way you accept the things about a person that are simply part of who they are. Robert was a private man in certain ways. He had always had projects. He loved machinery the way some men love music or painting with a quiet intensity that didn't need an audience. The workshop was his. She had the garden, the house, the books. He had that rusted shed. She had never questioned it. She went back inside and sat at Robert's desk in the small room off the hallway that he had used as an office. She needed to start packing. She needed to figure out where she was going to go, how she was going to live on a Social Security income in a world where a studio apartment cost $1,200 a month. She needed to be practical. Instead, she found herself looking at his desk's drawers. She had not opened them since he died. She had cleaned the house room by room in the months after his death, had given away his clothes, had dealt with his truck and his tools and his collection of automotive magazines going back to 1978. But the desk drawers she had left alone. She told herself it was because she wasn't ready. The truth was probably simpler than that. She was afraid of what she would find, or afraid of what she wouldn't. She pulled open the top drawer. Inside a phone charger, 2 pens, a small notepad, a roll of stamps. Normal things. She moved to the second drawer. Insurance documents, farm records, a folder of receipts going back several years. She went through them methodically, setting aside anything that might be relevant to the estate, setting aside everything else. She reached the bottom drawer. It held a Bible she had given him in 1984, his reading glasses, 3 pairs because he was always losing them, and a small envelope of photographs she hadn't seen before. She opened the envelope and looked through them. Old photos. Robert as a young man, late 20s, standing next to a car she didn't recognize. Robert in his 30s, working on something mechanical, his hands dark with grease, and his face concentrated and satisfied in the way she had always loved. A photo of the 2 of them from what looked like the early 1990s, standing in front of the barn, Eleanor laughing at something off camera, Robert looking at her instead of at whoever was taking the picture. She put the photos back in the envelope and set them on the desk. And then her hand found something at the very back of the drawer behind the Bible, tucked against the wood so deliberately that she almost missed it. A box. Small, maybe 5 inches across, made of oak. Handmade, she could tell immediately the joints were hand-cut, the surfaces sanded smooth by hand, the kind of work you could tell from the slight imperfections that made it more beautiful than anything a machine could produce. On the bottom of the box, carved into the wood, was something sharp and careful for when you need me most. Eleanor set the box on the desk and looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the latch. Inside, a small brass key, old and slightly tarnished, and a folded piece of paper. She recognized the handwriting before she even unfolded the note. Robert's script, precise, unhurried, the letters formed with the same patient attention he gave to everything he built. Eleanor, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I've thought about how to write that sentence for years, and there is no way to make it easier, so I won't try. I'm sorry I left you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to sit across from whatever banker or lawyer or county official has made your life difficult today. I know you're frightened. I know you're alone in a way I never wanted you to be. And I need you to know that I knew this moment might come, and I made sure it wouldn't be the end of your story. The key in this box opens the workshop, the one I never let you inside. The one I told you was too full of sharp tools and junk and reasons for you to worry. I kept you out because I was protecting a secret, not because I didn't trust you, because I trusted you completely. I kept it secret because I wanted it to be perfect, because I wanted it to be enough. I've been working on something since before we were married, since before I bought this farm, something I started because I believed in it and kept going because I believed in you. Open the workshop when you're ready. I think you'll know when that is. I love you more than I ever said, and I said it a great deal. Yours always and completely. Robert. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest and looked out the window at the workshop at the edge of the field. Robert had kept a secret from her for their entire marriage. She tried to understand how she felt about that and found that she felt only one thing clearly: hope. A fragile, tentative, deeply unfamiliar feeling, like a plant pushing up through cracked concrete. She sat with the letter and the key for the rest of the afternoon. She made dinner that she didn't eat. She sat in the living room as the light left the sky and the farm went dark. She thought about Robert, not the Robert of the last years, diminished by illness, quiet in the ways that sick men become quiet, but the Robert of their middle years when he was strong and capable and moved through the world with a competence that she had always found deeply reassuring. He had never been a man who made promises he couldn't keep. She had not once in 42 years had reason to doubt him. At 5 o'clock the following morning, before the sun was fully up, Eleanor Dawson put on her coat and her boots and walked across the farm to the workshop. The morning was cold and absolutely still. Her breath came in small clouds. The ground was hard underfoot, the grass stiff with frost. Around her, the farm lay quiet in the early dark, the shapes of the barn and the bins and the fence lines barely visible against the pale gray of the eastern sky. The workshop looked smaller in the half-dark, 12 feet wide, maybe 18 feet long. The corrugated metal walls had shed their color, entirely gone, the mottled brown and orange of deep rust. The roof line sagged in the middle, one end lower than the other. It looked like something that had been forgotten so long it had stopped expecting to be remembered. She stood in front of the padlocked door. The key slid into the lock without resistance, smooth, easy, as if the mechanism had been freshly oiled. It had. Robert had been here last. These were among the last things his hands had touched. She pulled the lock free and set it on the ground. The door was a sliding panel on a track, heavy, and she had to brace her feet and pull with her full weight. Metal scraped against metal, rust flaking away in orange chips, and the door groaned in a long, low complaint before it broke free and rolled aside. The interior was dark. No window she could see. Eleanor pulled out her phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and the first thing she saw was not the car. The first thing she saw was the walls. Pegboards floor to ceiling lined every wall. Tools hung from them in precise arrangements. Wrenches sorted by size, screwdrivers standing in rows, pliers and clamps and specialty instruments. She couldn't name each one in its own place, each one clean. Below the pegboards were shelves, cans of paint and lacquer, bottles of polish and lubricant. boxes of parts labeled in Robert's handwriting. On the workbench along the back wall, a journal lay closed beside a neat row of pencils. Robert had not said the workshop was a mess because he wanted to keep her out. He had said it because he knew her well enough to know that a perfectly organized workshop would make her more curious, not less. She moved the flashlight beam to the center of the space. The shape there was large, low and long, car-sized, covered completely by a canvas that had been tucked and tied at every edge with the methodical care of a man who knew exactly what he was protecting. Eleanor approached it slowly. She found the first rope and worked it loose, then the second, then the third. Her hands were shaking from the cold, from the anticipation, from the grief that moved through her in waves whenever she was confronted with fresh evidence of Robert's presence in the world. She gripped the edge of the canvas and pulled. It slid away all at once. The flashlight beam found it, and Eleanor Dawson stopped breathing. She did not know in that moment what she was looking at. She would learn the name later, would come to understand the history and the rarity and the extraordinary value of what Robert had left her. But in that first moment, standing alone in a rusted shed on a frostbitten Iowa morning, none of that mattered. What she saw was color. A blue so deep and so pure it seemed to generate its own light. A rich, saturated blue like October sky at noon, running the length of a low-slung body that crouched over wide tires like something about to leap. Two white stripes ran from the front of the hood straight back to the tail, precise as ruled lines, and the chrome that edged every surface caught the beam of her phone and threw it back in small, fierce stars. She walked around it. She walked around it slowly, the way you walk around something you don't entirely believe is real. The curves of the body were unlike anything she had seen before, aggressive and elegant. At the same time, the fenders flared wide over those enormous tires, the long hood tapering to a blunt nose. Along the lower flanks ran a pair of side pipes, wide tubes of polished metal that ran from the front wheels to behind the rear, and they looked, Eleanor thought, like the exhaust of something that belonged in the sky rather than on a road. She looked through the windows. Leather seats dark as mahogany, a wooden steering wheel, gauges arranged across a dashboard like instruments on a plane. Everything clean, everything perfect, everything exactly where it was meant to be. On the workbench, she found a folder. Inside the folder were documents, dozens of them organized in careful order. Bills of sale, receipts, photographs, a thick leather-bound journal. She lifted the journal and opened it to the first page. Restoration log, CSX 3294. Robert W. Dawson, begun May 1974. She turned to the back of the folder and found what she was looking for without knowing she was looking for it. An envelope sealed with her name written across the front. She opened it. Inside was a key, a small, ordinary-looking key, nothing like the brass one she'd found in the box, and a folded note, 3 lines in Robert's handwriting. Before you do anything else, start it. Just once. I want you to hear what 40 years sounds like when it finally gets to breathe. But be careful, this machine is not gentle. Don't try to drive it. Just start it and listen. I'll be listening too. Eleanor stood in the cold dark of that shed for a long moment. Then she opened the car door. It swung outward on hinges that moved without sound, without the slightest resistance, perfectly maintained, and the smell that came from inside was leather and oil, and something else she couldn't name, the smell of time, maybe of 4 decades of careful work in a locked room. The seat adjusted perfectly to her, as if it had been set for her specifically. She thought about that and then stopped thinking about it because she knew it was true. She put the key in the ignition. She turned it. The engine came alive with a sound that was not a sound so much as a physical fact. It moved through her chest and up into her throat and filled the inside of that rusted shed until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate. Deep, unstoppable. The sound of something that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. Eleanor Dawson sat with both hands on the wooden steering wheel in the dark, in the cold, in the ruins of everything she thought she had lost, and she listened to Robert's secret speak for the first time. She listened until the tears made it impossible to see, and then she sat and listened some more. She was still sitting there when the fuel ran low and the engine coughed and settled into silence. She drove back to the house in the dark. She sat at the kitchen table with Robert's note in her hand and the small car key beside her coffee cup, and she did not sleep. At 7:15 the next morning, her phone rang. It was Norma Briggs, 65 years old, her nearest neighbor, a quarter-mile up the road. They had been friends for 20 years, the kind of friends who don't need reasons to call. "Ellie," Norma's voice had something careful in it. "You doing all right over there?" "I'm managing," Eleanor said. "I'm glad to hear it. Listen, I don't want to alarm you, but I heard something last night coming from the direction of your back property. A kind of rumbling like a motor, but deeper. I figured maybe you'd got a generator running or something." "I had some equipment on," Eleanor said, which was true in its way. "Okay, good." A pause. "There's one other thing. I got up at 6 this morning to let the dog out, and there was a car parked at the bottom of your road. Dark blue sedan, didn't recognize it. It sat there for about 20 minutes and then drove off." Eleanor was quiet. "Could be nothing," Norma said. "Could be someone who got lost. But I know you're going through a hard time right now, and I just thought you should know." "Thank you, Norma," Eleanor said. "I appreciate you looking out." She hung up and sat with her hands flat on the table. Victor Crane had stood in her yard the previous morning and looked at the workshop for 30 seconds while talking on his phone. And this morning before dawn, someone had been parked at the bottom of her road. Eleanor looked at the folder of documents sitting on the table where she had brought them in from the shed. She looked at the leather journal. She looked at the key. Then she stood up, went to Robert's desk, and opened the bottom drawer. She found a legal notepad and a pen. At the top of the first page, she wrote the date. Below it, she wrote Robert's workshop, Shelby Cobra, 427SC, 1967. One of 31 ever made. She had read that in the journal the night before. She had not fully understood what it meant yet. She was going to find out. Eleanor spent the rest of that morning at Robert's workbench. She had carried the journal and the folder of documents back into the workshop. With a thermos of coffee and her reading glasses and a blanket she wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. She pulled the workbench stool to the center of the shed, where the light from her phone and a battery lantern she'd found on the shelf gave her enough to read by, and she began at the beginning. The journal was thick. 300 pages, maybe more, filled from margin to margin in Robert's precise handwriting, 48 years of entries beginning in May of 1974 and ending 11 weeks before he died. She did not try to read all of it. She read enough. She learned that the car had a name, or rather a number, CSX3294, stamped into a small plate on the chassis and cross-referenced in the documents against the original factory records from Shelby American in Los Angeles. She learned that it was a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427SC, the SC, standing for semi-competition, which the journal explained meant it was built for men who wanted a race car they could also drive to the grocery store, though Robert noted with dry precision that no one had ever used one for that purpose. She learned there had been exactly 31 of them made. She learned that Robert had bought it in May of 1974 from a man named Gerald Thurston in Ames, Iowa, who had acquired it from a regional racing driver who used it as a personal car between circuits. The purchase price was $8,000, which Robert had noted in parentheses was every dollar he had saved in 4 years of working as a mechanic in Davenport. She learned that at that time the car was in poor condition. The engine seized the body, damaged the interior, destroyed, and that Robert had seen past all of it to something he believed in with a certainty that he never once questioned across the decades that followed. She learned on page 12 of the journal that he had almost told her in 2008. October 14, 2008. Sat in here tonight with the lights off for 2 hours. Eleanor doesn't know. The bank called again today. We're 3 payments behind, and the corn price isn't going to recover before spring. I could sell this car right now and clear the debt. Could probably get $300,000 for it, maybe $350,000 in the right room. That would solve everything. But it wouldn't be everything this car is going to be worth in another 10 years. Another 15. The provenance documentation isn't complete yet. The interior restoration isn't finished. Half measures don't solve half problems, they just delay full ones. And Eleanor deserves the full thing. She always has. I turned the lights back on and went back to work. Eleanor read that entry 3 times. She sat with it the way you sit with something that reorders your understanding of a person you thought you knew completely. He had been in this shed in the dark 14 years ago, choosing her future over their present crisis. Not out of stubbornness, not out of pride, out of a clear-eyed calculation that she deserved everything he could give her and that everything required patience. She turned to the last entry in the journal. November 19th, 2 years prior. The handwriting was slightly less certain than the earlier entries, the hand of a man whose body was beginning to argue with him. Last detail on the provenance package went to the P.O. box today. Documentation is complete. CSX-3294 is as authenticated as any Cobra in existence. I sent the package to R.M. Sotheby's for a preliminary assessment. Expect to hear back in 4 to 6 weeks. If I'm right about the market, Eleanor will never have to worry again. I don't know how much time I have. The doctor uses careful words. I've learned to listen to what careful words are covering up. Whatever happens, this is finished. This is ready. I did what I set out to do. Eleanor closed the journal and set it on the workbench. She sat for a while in the quiet of the shed with the blue car beside her and the cold coming in under the edges of the metal walls, and she thought about the man who had worked in this room for half a century, who had come out here after dinner while she read in the living room, who had spent winter Saturdays in here while she cooked and cleaned and ran the domestic machinery of their life together, who had told her every time she asked that he was just tinkering with old equipment, nothing worth seeing. It's a mess in there. I'll clean it up one of these days. She thought about what it costs a man to keep a secret that long. Not from dishonesty, from love. Then she picked up her phone and started searching. She was not comfortable with technology. Robert had been better with it than her, and she had never fully closed that gap. But she was a methodical woman, and she knew how to look for things when she needed to find them. She searched for Shelby Cobra, 427SC, auction results, and was immediately confronted with numbers that didn't look real. She searched for CSX-3294 and found references in collector forms to a car with that chassis number that had been, as one post put it, missing from public records since the mid-70s. She found a name that appeared in multiple articles about significant American automobile preservation: Margot Hale, Senior Curator of the American Automotive Heritage Museum in Chicago. She found the museum's website and a contact email and a brief biography that described Margot as having spent 30 years documenting and authenticating muscle car history with particular expertise in Shelby products. Eleanor wrote an email. She kept it short because she didn't know how much of what she had was real yet, and she didn't want to sound like a woman who didn't know what she had. My name is Eleanor Dawson. I live in Grover County, Iowa. My husband passed away 14 months ago and left me a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427SC, chassis number CSX-3294. He restored it over approximately 40 years and compiled what appears to be complete provenance documentation. I need to understand what I have and what I should do with it. If you have any knowledge of this car or any willingness to advise me, I would be grateful. She sent it and went back to the house to make lunch. The reply came at 4:17 that afternoon, while Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen table going through Robert's financial records. Mrs. Dawson, I received your email an hour ago, and I have been sitting here since then trying to decide whether to call you immediately or give myself time to compose a professional response. I have decided on the former. Please call me at any time. CSX-3294 has been on the radar of the Cobra community for nearly 50 years. It is one of the most significant, unaccounted-for vehicles in American automotive history. If what you're describing is accurate, this is not a small matter. Margot Hale. Eleanor called the number at the bottom of the email. Margot Hale's voice was calm, precise, and very clearly working to stay that way. She asked questions for 20 minutes. Make, model, chassis number, condition documentation. When Eleanor described the provenance folder in the restoration journal, there was a pause on the line that lasted long enough that Eleanor asked if she was still there. I'm here, Margot said. Mrs. Dawson, I want to come see this car. I can be in Iowa by tomorrow afternoon if you'll allow it. I understand that's an unusual request from a stranger, and I understand if you'd prefer more time. But I want you to know that what you're describing, if it is what it sounds like, is genuinely significant. And I want to make sure you have the right information before anyone else gets to you. Anyone else, Eleanor repeated. There are people who pay attention to these things. Collector networks, dealers, auction scouts. The Cobra community is not large, and it is not quiet. Once word gets out that CSX-3294 has surfaced. You will have phone calls. Eleanor thought of Victor Crane's car stopped at the bend in the lane, his eyes on the shed. Tomorrow afternoon is fine, she said. Margot Hale arrived at 2 o'clock in a rental car that she parked carefully at the edge of the gravel, as if even the act of arrival should be done with attention. She was 52, compact and unhurried, in the way of people who have spent careers handling things that cannot be replaced. She shook Eleanor's hand and thanked her for the drive from the airport in Des Moines and asked no questions about the car until Eleanor opened the workshop door. Then she stopped walking. She stood at the threshold and looked at the Cobra in the afternoon light coming through the open door, and for a moment her professional composure simply left her face. She pressed one hand to her mouth. She said nothing. Then she stepped inside. She spent 3 hours with the car and the documentation. She moved around the vehicle with a combination of technical precision and something that looked very much like reverence, crouching to examine welds, running her fingers along paint seams, reading the chassis number stamp with a loop she produced from her jacket pocket. She went through the provenance folder page by page. She read sections of Robert's restoration journal and stopped twice to write notes of her own. When she finally sat down on Robert's workbench stool, Eleanor was watching her face. "Your husband," Margot said carefully, "was one of the finest amateur restorers I have encountered in 30 years of this work. And I use the word amateur only in its original sense, a person who does something out of love, not for compensation. The technical quality of this restoration is equal to or better than work I've seen from professional restoration shops charging 6 figures for their time. He was a mechanic before we bought the farm," Eleanor said. "He understood machines the way some people understand language." Margot nodded. She opened the provenance folder to a specific section and set it on the workbench between them. "Mrs. Dawson, I need to show you something." It was an envelope, sealed unopened. Eleanor had seen it in the folder, but had assumed it was another of Robert's documents and had set it aside. It was not one of Robert's documents. The return address was R.M. Sotheby's. Robert's P.O. box number was typed on the front. The postmark was dated 8 weeks before Robert had died. "I'd like you to open that," Margot said. "It's addressed to your husband's box, and it's your property." Eleanor opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, formal letterhead, a brief paragraph of professional language, and at the bottom of the page, a number. "Preliminary auction estimate for CSX 3294, pending in-person assessment and final documentation review. $1,600,000, $1,900,000. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment. "He knew," she said. "He knew," Margot confirmed. "He received this and didn't tell you. He was protecting the surprise." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and set it on the workbench. "He always believed that a gift given too early wasn't a gift, it was just money. He wanted me to find it when I needed it, not before." Margot was quiet for a moment, watching Eleanor's face. Then she said, "I want to be transparent with you. My museum would be very interested in acquiring this car. That's a conversation we can have properly with lawyers involved on both sides, at whatever pace you're comfortable with. But I'm telling you now because you deserve to know that I'm not a neutral party." "I appreciate that," Eleanor said. "What I am, regardless of any acquisition interest, is someone who wants to make sure you're not taken advantage of. And I need to ask you directly, has anyone else approached you about this car?" Eleanor told her about Victor Crane. She told her about the stop car at the end of the lane and about Norma Briggs's call. She told her about the 30-day foreclosure notice and the $180,000 debt. Margot listened without expression. When Eleanor finished, she said, "I want you to promise me something. Don't agree to any offer from anyone without calling me first." "I promise," Eleanor said. The next morning they came. Victor Crane arrived at 9 o'clock with a man Eleanor had not seen before, heavy-set, late 60s, wearing an overcoat that probably cost more than Robert's truck. He had the bearing of a man who had been told he was right about things for so long that he had stopped questioning whether he was. His name, Victor said, was Leonard Ashford, a private collector out of Des Moines, a man who appreciated fine automobiles. Eleanor let them into the workshop. Leonard Ashford walked around the Cobra twice. His face showed nothing, the face of a man practiced at hiding what he knew. He looked at the chassis plate. He looked at the side pipes. He looked at the paint along the rear quarter panel, with an expression of mild interest that Eleanor recognized immediately as performance. "It's in decent shape," he said finally. "Condition is fair. The restoration work is competent, but not professional. There are a few areas I'd want to address." He turned to Eleanor with a benevolent smile. "I can offer you $150,000 for it. Cash. We can close this week." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she went to the workbench and picked up Robert's restoration journal. She opened it to a page she had marked with a strip of paper that morning while she was drinking her coffee and preparing for exactly this conversation. August 14th, 1991. She read aloud without inflection. "Sourced original spec leather for the seats from the only remaining supplier in the country with authentic material, Hargrove Upholstery in Tucson, Arizona. Paid $2,200 for enough to do both seats and the door panels. Took 4 months to find them. Took another 6 months to do the installation correctly. The stitching pattern is original to the 1967 factory spec." She turned to another marked page. March 3rd, 2003. Paint finished. Guardsman blue exact formula. Matched to original factory color codes from the Shelby American production records. 3 coats base, 4 coats clear, each coat wet sanded between applications. Color depth matches factory original. This took 14 months. She closed the journal and looked at Leonard Ashford. "Stitching pattern," she said. "Original to the 1967 factory specification. I'd like to ask you something, Mr. Ashford. Can you describe for me what that stitching pattern looks like on an authentic 427SC interior?" Leonard Ashford looked at her. "I'm not here to be tested," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "You're not. You're here because you know exactly what this car is, and you're hoping I don't." She set the journal back on the workbench. "You recognized it the moment you walked through that door. The way your eyes went straight to the side pipes. That's not what someone does when they're assessing condition. That's what someone does when they're confirming identity." Something moved across Leonard Ashford's face. Not shame, not quite. Something closer to the adjustment a person makes when they realize the ground has shifted under them. Victor Crane stepped forward. "Mrs. Dawson, I think we're getting off track. Leonard is making you a fair offer. The car has a preliminary auction estimate of between $1.6 and $1.9 million, Eleanor said. "From R.M. Sotheby's, dated 2 months before my husband died. He had the letter. I have it now." The workshop was very quiet. "I'd like both of you to leave my property," Eleanor said. "Please do so now." They left. Victor Crane said something as he crossed the yard about deadlines and about what happened to assets during foreclosure proceedings, and Eleanor stood in the door of the workshop and let his words go past her like wind. When their car was gone, she sat down on Robert's stool and noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from the effort of staying calm when she had wanted very badly not to be. She pressed her palms flat against the legs of her jeans and breathed. She thought about Robert, about every hour he had spent in this room while she thought he was tinkering, about the entry dated October 2008 where he had sat in the dark and chosen patience, about the letter from Sotheby's that he had read alone and filed away and carried with him to his death because the gift wasn't ready to be given yet. She thought about what it would have meant if she had not found the box in the drawer, if she had packed up the house and walked away in 30 days without ever knowing the key existed. The bank would have taken the farm. The farm included the workshop. The workshop contained a car worth nearly $2 million and that would have passed to the bank's asset inventory, appraised by someone like Leonard Ashford, sold for a fraction of its value. Robert had trusted her to find it. He had put it in the drawer of his desk in the most private room of the house, in a place she would eventually have to go. He had trusted her to be curious enough, to be brave enough, to be strong enough. She called Margot. "They came," she said. "Victor Crane and a collector named Leonard Ashford. He offered $150,000. There was a silence on the other end. "Leonard Ashford," Margot said. "I know that name. He knew what the car was. He tried to hide it, but he knew. Mrs. Dawson, I want to be careful about how I say this. Leonard Ashford has been investigated twice in the last decade for predatory acquisition practices. He identifies estates and situations of financial distress and moves quickly before families have time to seek independent valuation." Another pause. "I don't know how he knew about your car." Eleanor thought about Victor Crane's phone call at the bend in the lane. "I think I might," she said. Whatever the connection is, Margot said, you handled it exactly right. I need you to hold on for a few more days. My board meets Friday. I want to bring this to them formally with my full assessment. Can you give me until Friday? Victor Crane says they can move the foreclosure date up. He called it a technical provision in the mortgage agreement. Has he given you that in writing? Eleanor looked at the legal note found on the kitchen table where she had been keeping her records. Not yet. Until he does, I'd treat it as a pressure tactic. In the meantime, don't speak to anyone from the bank without a lawyer present. A brief pause. I know this is overwhelming. You're doing everything right. Your husband knew what he was doing when he left this to you. Eleanor said thank you and hung up. She looked out the kitchen window at the workshop. The sun was getting low, throwing long shadows across the yard. From this distance, the shed looked exactly as it had always looked, rusted, sagging, barely standing. Not a place that held anything worth noticing. Not a place worth a second glance. Robert had understood something, she thought. He had understood that the best way to protect something was to make it look like nothing. You don't guard treasure by building a vault. You guard it by making everyone walk past it for 40 years without a second look. She went back to her notepad. She wrote down the names and the offer and the time and the words she remembered from the conversation. Then she went to the bookshelf in the living room and found the box where Robert had kept important documents and pulled out his old address book, actual paper, actual handwriting, because Robert had never trusted information he couldn't hold in his hand. She found the number she was looking for under G. Gary Polzian. Robert had known him since the 1970s, a lawyer in Ames who had handled their farm contracts for 30 years, and who was, as Robert had once said, the kind of man who reads the fine print before he eats a restaurant menu. She called him. She told him enough of the story that he asked her to start from the beginning, and she did. When she finished, Gary was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, he said, do not sign anything, do not accept anything, and do not let anyone onto that property without calling me first. I'll pull the mortgage documents tonight. If the bank is claiming a technical provision to accelerate the foreclosure, I want to see that language. Thank you, Gary. Don't thank me. Robert Dawson helped me move a transmission once in a parking lot in 1979 when my truck broke down and he wouldn't take a dime. I've been waiting 30 years to return the favor. She hung up. She made herself dinner and ate it this time. She went back to the workshop after dark with the lantern and sat with the car for an hour, not reading, not researching, just sitting. The blue of the body had gone deep and almost black in the low light, but the chrome still caught the lantern glow and threw it back in small shifting sparks. She thought about Robert, 21 years old, handing over every dollar he had saved to a stranger in Ames for a car that most people would have walked past. She thought about what he had seen in it that no one else saw. The same things she supposed that he had always seen in things that others underestimated. He had been doing it her whole life. On Friday morning, Margot Hale called at 9:45. The board met last night, she said. I presented my full assessment along with the documentation and my photographic record from the site visit. And Eleanor said, we would like to make a formal offer of $1.35 million for CSX 3294. That includes full provenance documentation and restoration materials. We would also like to propose a permanent exhibit dedicated to Robert's restoration work. His journal, his photographs, his process displayed alongside the car, his name on the wall. Eleanor sat down. We can structure the transaction to complete within 10 business days. Margot continued, I understand you have a timeline that makes speed important. It's more than enough, Eleanor said. The cart's more than enough. I also want to be transparent about one more thing, Margot said. The preliminary Sotheby's estimate was $1.6 to $1.9 million. Our offer of $1.35 million is below that range. At auction with the right room and the right timing, you might realize more. I don't want you to feel that we're taking advantage of your situation. If you want to pursue the auction route, we would support that. Eleanor looked out the window at the workshop. She thought about what Robert had written in his final journal entry. This is ready. I did what I set out to do. He didn't leave me this car so I could get the highest possible number, she said. He left it so I'd be taken care of, and so that whatever he built would be seen by someone who understood what it was. She paused. Have the paperwork drawn up, she said. I'll have my lawyer review it. Of course, Margot said. Eleanor, for what it's worth, your husband was exceptional. Not the restoration, though, that is extraordinary, but what he did and why he did it. In 30 years, I have never encountered anything quite like it. No, Eleanor said. Neither have I. She hung up the phone and sat at Robert's kitchen table in Robert's house on Robert's farm, and for the first time in 14 months, she felt the weight that had been pressing on her chest begin very slowly to lift. Gary Poldzin drove out from Ames on Monday morning with a briefcase and a thermos of his own coffee and spent 4 hours at the kitchen table going through every page of the museum's acquisition agreement. He was 71 years old and read contracts the way Robert had read engines, looking for the thing that shouldn't be there. The small tolerance that would become a big problem down the road. He found nothing to object to. It's a clean offer, he told Eleanor when he was done. Straightforward sale, clear title transfer payment in full on closing. The exhibit provision is non-binding on your end. You can participate as much or as little as you want. He set down his pen. The number is fair given the timeline. At auction, you might do better. You might also wait 6 months for the right event in the right room and the right bidders all showing up at the same time. And in 6 months, Eleanor said, I don't have the farm. No, you don't. He looked at her over the top of his glasses. This is a good offer, Eleanor. Robert would have taken it. She signed the agreement that afternoon. The next morning, she drove to First Harvest Bank in Grover County and asked to see Victor Crane. She was made to wait 11 minutes in the lobby, which she suspected was intentional. The lobby was all marble and dark wood, and the particular kind of quiet that institutions use to remind you that they are permanent and you are not. Eleanor sat in one of the leather chairs and looked at the painting on the wall, a landscape Iowa fields in summer green and gold and orderly, and thought about the 80 acres she had worked for 4 decades and what green and gold had looked like when it came with debt and weather and the uncertainty of every harvest. Victor Crane appeared at the top of the stairs with his practiced smile already in place. Mrs. Dawson, this is a surprise. I wasn't expecting. I have something for you, Eleanor said. She stood and opened her bag and took out the certified check that she and Gary had arranged through the title company the previous day. The closing funds had cleared that morning, transferred from the museum's acquisition account. She had spoken to Margot twice to confirm the numbers and then sat at Robert's kitchen table and looked at the figure on the transfer confirmation for a long time before she printed it. $1,350,000. From that, she had paid Gary's fees and set aside the tax liability, which Gary had estimated conservatively and which she had set aside in a separate account to be dealt with properly. What remained in the certified check she was now holding out to Victor Crane was exactly $180,000, the precise figure on the foreclosure notice that had been sitting on her kitchen table for 3 weeks. Victor Crane looked at the check. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he was told was not going to happen. This pays the debt in full, Eleanor said, principal and all accrued interest and fees as calculated by your own office. She had asked Gary to verify the payoff figure twice. I'd like a receipt and a written confirmation that the foreclosure proceedings have been withdrawn. Victor Crane took the check. He looked at it again, then looked at Eleanor, then looked at the check once more. The lobby was quiet around them. The teller at the nearest window was very carefully looking at something else. I'll have the paperwork drawn up, Victor said. His voice had changed, not much but enough. I'll wait, Eleanor said and sat back down. She had her receipt 40 minutes later. She drove home on roads she had driven her entire adult life, past fields that were beginning to show the first suggestions of winter wheat, the soil dark and the sky high and clear and cold. She drove past the turnoff for the Briggs place and past the old grain elevator that had been out of operation since 2015 and past the stand of cottonwoods that marked the corner of her property. She pulled into the driveway of 4114 Mill Creek Road and sat in her truck for a moment before going inside. The farm was hers, fully cleanly with no debt and no 30-day notice and no Victor Crane making his way up the front walk in an expensive suit. The fields were hers. The barn was hers. The tree they had planted the year they understood they would not have children, grown now to a height that would have made Robert smile, was hers. The workshop still rusted, still sagging, still looking like nothing from the outside, that was hers too. She went inside and called Norma Briggs. Put on coffee, she said. I have something to tell you. 3 days after Eleanor signed the final closing documents, a collector from Houston called her on the house phone. She did not know how he had gotten the number. His name was Warren Price, and he had a slow, patient voice and the careful courtesy of a man who closed deals by making the other person feel that agreeing with him was their own idea. He told her he had heard through channels he didn't specify that a significant Shelby had recently surfaced in Iowa. He told her he had been collecting American muscle cars for 30 years and that his collection was private, well-maintained, and climate-controlled. He told her that he was prepared to offer $1.85 million for CSX 3294, no auction, no middleman cash transfer in 48 hours. Eleanor listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The car has already been sold." A pause. "To a museum." "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Dawson, I hope you don't mind me saying a museum offer is almost certainly below private market value. If you're open to discussing the acquisition agreement, there may be grounds to reconsider." "Mr. Price," Eleanor said, "my husband spent 40 years building that car. He documented every part, every hour, every decision he made across 5 decades of work. He kept a journal that runs to 300 pages. He was a mechanic from Davenport, Iowa, who saw something in a ruined machine that no one else saw, and he spent his life making sure the world would eventually see it too." She paused. "The museum is going to put his name on the wall. His journal is going to be in the exhibit. People are going to stand in front of that car and learn who built it and why. That is not something I can put a number on, and it is not something I would trade for an extra $500,000 going into a climate-controlled garage in Houston where no one but you would ever see it." Warren Price was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your husband sounds like he was a remarkable man." "He was," Eleanor said. "Thank you for calling." She hung up and wrote the conversation in her notepad. Date name offer declined. She had been keeping the log since the first morning, the way Robert had kept his restoration journal, methodically, completely leaving a record that could not be disputed. It occurred to her that she had learned that from him without knowing she was learning it. The workshop renovation took 6 weeks. Eleanor had thought carefully about what she wanted and had decided that the outside would stay exactly as it was. The rust, the sagging roofline, the corrugated metal walls gone orange with decades of Iowa weather. From the road, from the yard, from any angle outside, it would look precisely as it had always looked. This mattered to her in a way she didn't try to explain to the contractor. She hired a quiet man named Dell from 2 towns over, who did good work and didn't ask unnecessary questions. What she told him was what she wanted on the inside. The floors were leveled and poured smooth and finished in a pale gray that held light. 3 large skylights were cut into the roof, and the afternoon light that came through them was the kind of light painters spend careers chasing. The walls were insulated and drywalled and painted white, a clean, even white that made the space feel 3 times larger than its actual dimensions. Electrical was run properly with outlets at workbench height along every wall. Robert's workbench was left exactly as it was. She had specified this to Dell on the first day and again on the last day to make sure nothing was moved or replaced or tidied into something it wasn't. The pegboard above it stayed with his tools still hanging in the arrangements he had chosen. The shelves beside it held his labeled boxes and cans. His 3 pairs of reading glasses were in the small tray where he had always put them. She had a glazier come out and build a low glass case that sat at the end of the workbench, 6 feet long and lit from below. Inside the case, she placed the restoration journal open to the first page. Beside it, she placed the small oak box with the brass key, the one she'd found in the drawer, the key that had started all of it. Beside that, she placed Robert's 1974 bill of sale, the original document, $8,000 in faded typewriter ink, the receipt for the biggest gamble he ever made. At the back of the case, framed in simple oak, she placed the R.M. Sotheby's estimate letter. Folded as she had found it, the fold lines visible, the postmark clear. The letter Robert had read alone and carried with him in silence, and filed away because the time wasn't right yet. On the wall above the workbench, she hung 2 things. The first was the photograph she had found in Robert's bottom drawer, the one of him in his early 30s, standing beside the stripped chassis, his hands dark with grease, and his face wearing that particular expression of concentrated satisfaction. On the back of the photograph in his handwriting, 1978, Martha's future taking shape. Except Robert had written Eleanor's name, not Martha's, and she had looked at that for a long time before she understood that it didn't matter whose name was written there. What mattered was what he had meant. The second was a framed card, white background, simple text, the same font and size she had seen on the exhibit notes at the one museum she had ever visited with Robert in Chicago 20 years ago. Robert William Dawson, 1951 to 2022. Mechanic, farmer, husband. He spent 40 years building something his wife didn't know existed so that she would never have to face the world without a foundation beneath her. This was his workshop. These were his tools. The car that stood here is now at the American Automotive Heritage Museum in Chicago. The love that built it has never left this room. She had written it herself at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night and had thrown away 4 drafts before she wrote the one she kept. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Not an email, a letter. Handwritten on plain stationery, postmarked from Kearney, Nebraska, addressed in a careful older hand to Eleanor Dawson at 4114 Mill Creek Road, Grover County, Iowa. She almost didn't open it the same day. She had been getting calls and messages since a brief article ran in the Grover County Courier about the foreclosure withdrawal, a small piece that mentioned the museum sale without many details, but enough that people who knew her had been reaching out. She assumed this was more of the same. She opened it after dinner. The letter was 2 pages written front and back in a hand that started steady and got less so toward the end. Dear Mrs. Dawson, my name is Ruth Calvert. I am 72 years old and I live in Kearney, Nebraska, where my husband Dennis and I farmed cattle for 38 years until he died 5 years ago. Dennis was a mechanic before we bought our land. He loved cars the way your husband appears to have loved them. He had a workshop behind the house that I was never allowed inside, though he never said it in a way that made me ask. I thought it was his private space, and I respected that. When Dennis died, a man named Leonard Ashford came to see me within 3 weeks. He told me he was a collector, that he had heard Dennis had some interesting things on the property. He brought a younger man with him, who I later understood was connected to our bank. They looked at what was in Dennis's workshop, and they told me it was worth very little. They offered me $90,000, and they told me I needed to decide quickly because the estate taxes would be significant, and a fast sale was in my best interest. I sold. I found out 14 months later from an article in a car magazine someone sent me that the vehicle Leonard Ashford bought from me for $90,000 had been sold at auction for $980,000. I am not writing to you asking for anything. I have no legal claim, and I made my own decision, and I live with that. I am writing because I read the small article about your situation in an agricultural trade newsletter that a friend forwarded, and I wanted someone to know what happened to me. And I wanted to tell you that what you did, not accepting what they told you, not making the quick decision, holding out until you understood what you had, that was the right thing. My Dennis left me something too. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't find out in time. You found out in time. Thank you for not doing what I did. I mean that without bitterness. Knowing that someone else didn't lose what I lost is at this point in my life worth something to me. With respect and good wishes, Ruth Calvert. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. She thought about Ruth Calvert in Kearney, Nebraska, a woman she had never met who had signed a paper that cost her the better part of $1 million because a man named Leonard Ashford and a banker had arrived within 3 weeks of her husband's death and told her to decide quickly. She thought about what 3 weeks felt like when your husband had just died. She thought about how a woman alone on a farm facing estate paperwork and grief and the sudden need to understand finances she had never managed would feel when 2 confident men in expensive coats told her what something was worth. She thought about what Victor Crane had looked like standing in her kitchen, hands folded, voice reasonable, telling her that holding on wasn't noble, it was just prolonging the inevitable. Eleanor went to the desk and found a clean sheet of paper. She wrote back to Ruth Calvert that same night. She wrote 2 pages. She told Ruth about Robert in the workshop, in the journal, in the brass key in the oak box. She told her about finding the R.M. Sotheby's letter and what it said. She told her about Victor Crane and Leonard Ashford standing in the workshop while she read from Robert's journal, and about the moment she realized that the only weapon she needed was the knowledge Robert had left her. At the end of the letter she wrote, I have been thinking about what to do with what Robert left me, not just the money but the story and the lesson that came with it. I don't have an answer yet, but your letter has helped me understand something. It isn't enough to have been the one who found out in time. There have to be fewer women who find out too late. I would like to stay in correspondence with you if you're willing. I think we have things to say to each other that neither of us has been able to say to anyone else. She sealed the letter, addressed it, and put it on the table by the door to mail in the morning. Then she went to the workshop. She had bought supplies 2 weeks earlier, canvas brushes, oil paints, in colors she had chosen slowly in the art supply store in Des Moines, the way you choose things when you finally have permission to want them. She had set up the easel in the center of the workshop floor under the middle skylight where the afternoon light fell in a clean rectangle. She had not yet painted anything. She had stood in front of the blank canvas twice and found that she wasn't ready. Tonight she was ready. She set up the lantern at the angle she wanted. She looked at the empty space where the Cobra had stood, and she looked at the workbench with its tools and its glass case and the photograph of Robert on the wall, and she looked at the light coming through the new skylights and the way it fell across the old floor. She picked up a brush. She painted from memory, which was the only way she knew how. The image she had carried since the first morning, the blue car in the half-dark of the workshop, the canvas draped over it, the single beam of light from her phone cutting through the dust and finding that color, that extraordinary blue, and throwing it back at her like an answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. What emerged on the canvas was not technically perfect. She had not painted seriously since her 20s, and her hand remembered less than she had hoped. But the color was right. She had chosen the blue, carefully had mixed it twice before she was satisfied, and the light was right, and the feeling of the thing was right in the way that matters more than technique. When she stopped, her back ached and her eyes were tired, and she was satisfied in a way she had not been satisfied in a very long time. She cleaned her brushes and stood back and looked at what she had made. It would go to Chicago. Margot had asked when Eleanor mentioned she was painting if the museum might display it alongside the car and the exhibit materials. Eleanor had said she would think about it. Standing in her workshop at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, looking at the first painting she had completed in 40 years, she decided the answer was yes. She wanted people who stood in front of Robert's car to know that someone had loved him. That someone had stood in this room and seen what he had built and felt something that couldn't be measured in auction estimates, in provenance, documentation, and certified checks. She wanted them to see the car through her eyes on the morning she found it before she knew what it was worth. Because that was the moment that mattered. Not the transaction, not the number, not the restoration's technical achievement. The moment she pulled the canvas away and the light found the blue, and she understood that the man she had loved for 42 years had been all along quietly building her a future. In the spring, Margot sent photographs of the completed exhibit. The car was displayed in a room of its own, lit from above the blue paint, doing in museum light exactly what it had done in the beam of Eleanor's phone on that November morning, generating its own luminescence, pulling the eye, refusing to be ignored. The restoration journal was in a case beside it, open to a page Eleanor had chosen October 14th, 2008. The night Robert had sat in the dark and chosen patience. The name card on the wall read Robert William Dawson, mechanic, farmer, husband. This car was his life's work and his final gift. On the adjacent wall hung Eleanor's painting. She drove to Chicago in April with Norma Briggs, who insisted on coming and who talked for most of the 4-hour drive about her daughter and her grandchildren and the new fence she was putting in on the north property line, which was exactly the kind of conversation Eleanor needed for 4 hours. They stayed 2 nights in a hotel that was nicer than Eleanor had thought necessary, but that Norma had booked before Eleanor could object. She stood in front of the exhibit for a long time. She stood in front of the car and looked at it the way she had looked at it the first morning, as something she did not entirely believe was real. A man she had loved. 4 decades of quiet work. A shed that looked like nothing. She looked at her own painting on the wall and saw it as a stranger might see it, a woman's memory of a blue car in a dark room, rough with unpracticed technique, but true in its light, true in its color, true in the thing it was trying to say. Norma appeared at her elbow. "It's something," Norma said. She was not a woman who reached for extravagant language, and Eleanor valued that. "It is," Eleanor agreed. They had lunch in the museum cafe and drove home that afternoon. The fields along the interstate were green by then, the winter wheat up and the corn just beginning, the whole landscape doing what it had always done, recovering, insisting on itself, pushing up through whatever had pressed it down. Eleanor got home at 7. She changed her clothes and walked out to the workshop. She had been corresponding with Ruth Calvert for 3 months by then. Letters still, Ruth didn't use email, and Eleanor found that she preferred letters anyway. The physical weight of them, the evidence of a hand that had held a pen and meant what it wrote. They had exchanged 11 letters. Ruth had told her about Dennis, about the workshop, about the car she had never known the value of. Eleanor had told Ruth about Robert, about the journal, about Victor Crane's face when she handed him the check. In her most recent letter, Ruth had mentioned 2 other women, one in Kansas and one in southern Missouri, who had experienced situations similar to hers. Not identical, but close enough to constitute a pattern. Estates in financial distress. A collector appearing quickly with a banker not far behind. Assets undervalued and purchased before anyone had time to seek a second opinion. Eleanor had read that letter sitting at Robert's kitchen table and had thought for a long time. She had more money than she would spend in her remaining years, even accounting for the farm's ongoing costs and her own modest needs. She had the farm, which was now generating enough from a leasing arrangement with a neighboring operation to cover its own maintenance. She had the workshop, which was hers in every sense that mattered. She had something else, too. She had been the woman who found out in time, and she understood more clearly with each month that passed that having been lucky was not enough, that luck was not a plan, and knowledge was not automatically shared, and the people who preyed on grief and urgency would keep doing it as long as no one stopped them. She sat down at the workbench in the chair she had placed at Robert's workspace and took out the legal pad she kept there. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote Robert's Promise Fund. Below that, she wrote 2 names, Ruth Calvert, Gary Polzian. Below that, she wrote Purpose to provide independent valuation assistance and legal advocacy to widows and widowers facing estate asset decisions under financial pressure or time constraint, specifically in rural communities where access to specialist knowledge is limited. She did not write a mission statement. She did not write a strategic plan. She wrote a list of the things that would have helped her in those first weeks, a phone number to call, a person who knew what questions to ask, someone to stand between her and the people who arrived with clipboards in condescension and the false urgency of a closing window. She would call Gary in the morning. She would write to Ruth. There was a law clinic at the state university that Gary had mentioned in passing, a professor who had written about predatory estate acquisition in rural counties. She had the name written somewhere. It would take time. It would be complicated. She was 68 years old, and she had never run anything more complex than a household in a small cattle operation. But she had Robert's journal to tell her how to proceed. Not the specific details, those would be different, but the method. The thing the journal had taught her across 300 pages of careful entries was simply this. You decide what you're building and you show up for it, and you do the next thing that needs doing, and you don't stop because it takes longer than you expected. That was all he had done. For 48 years. She picked up the pen and kept writing. Outside, the workshop looked exactly as it always had. Rusted walls, sagging roof, a padlock on a sliding door. Nothing worth a second glance from the road. Nothing to suggest that inside, in a pool of skylight falling clean and straight onto a concrete floor, a woman was sitting at her late husband's workbench and planning something that hadn't existed in the world until tonight. The farm was quiet. The fields were dark. The tree they had planted the year they understood they would not have children stood at the edge of the yard, its new leaves small and certain in the April night. Eleanor Dawson wrote until midnight. Then she capped the pen, turned off the lantern, and walked back to the house under a sky full of stars. She had things to do in the morning.